Hey guys, I hope you're doing well. Today is going to be kind of part two to our topic dealing with pornography. So if you haven't yet, I encourage you to go back and obviously watch part one of this series. And I also would encourage you, if you haven't, go back and watch the very first video in this series. In that video, we talked about how do you create an atmosphere to have conversation about a number of issues, and pornography being one of them. And I think that will be really helpful and will kind of lay a good foundation for what exactly we'll talk about today as well. So I encourage you to go check those out. Now, right off the bat, if you, again, are a parent and you think about this whole topic of pornography and how it relates to your student or students, again, assuming they're in middle school or high school age, can I just encourage you, you need to have this conversation with them. I'm assuming most of you feel that need and the urgency based off of how prominent this is and how readily available pornography is within our society. But can I just, again, really encourage you, if you don't think that's an issue at all with your student, or you don't think that would come up in any capacity, I just want to, again, graciously nudge you to say, chances are it has or will very, very soon. And so as parents, we get that really the privilege of walking our students through life and really trying to point them to Jesus and point them to what he desires for us. And a big aspect of that is guarding and leading and encouraging. And so sometimes that means we need to prepare the way for them in that. So I encourage you to be that first voice, or continue to be that steady voice as they navigate through these issues. And again, deal with it ahead of time rather than retroactively. So one of the first big questions I want to kind of ask and hopefully answer for us is, how do we actually have a conversation with our student or students about pornography? If you're at a place where you're honestly just broaching this topic with them for the very first time and you just don't know how to bring it up, maybe give just two pretty basic suggestions for how you could go about that. Maybe you'll feel this out with your relationship with your student, their personality type, and which one maybe you think would be best. So first suggestion would just be to really kind of walk through even some of the statistics we talked about in the previous video, to help kind of connect the dots and point out within our culture just how sexualized things are, to be able to just remind them and show them, not obviously anything explicit, but just how media, again, really saturates everything within the messages that are communicated, to talk about sex, to talk about attraction, to talk about all of these issues, and to, again, bring that to their attention, and then, again, to gently just kind of steer the conversation to the reality that pornography is readily available online. And it's something that it's a easy stepping stone from what we see all around us to something that is so easily accessible. And just to have that basic conversation that with how accessible, with how prominent, with how really damaging this can be, it's critical that we talk about it, that we're guarded against it, that we have a plan on how to deal with that and approach it. And just equally, it's also critical that we really have a good understanding for the gift and the blessing that sex really is, based off how God has given that to us. So that would be one suggestion, just to help connect the dots to what they're already probably seeing around them, to help them be aware of how prominent just the readily available aspect of pornography is within our culture, and to just help them start to think about that and consider it. Another suggestion, which I think is potentially even more helpful, and maybe students might connect more with this type of conversation, is just to share kind of personal experience, to be transparent as an adult, to be vulnerable, and to share, back when you were a teenager, okay, was that at all an issue for you? And obviously pornography and the access to that looked different at that point, but when you were attracted to somebody, was there any struggles associated with that? Was there a draw that could have been acted upon in an inappropriate way? And you can be as explicit as you want in that, but to share just your attraction to the opposite sex, to share your draw in that way, and to be able to, again, just ask, Has that ever been something that you, again, have wrestled with, or you're kind of working through, or what does that look like for you? And to, in some ways, normalize how God has created us and what we're attracted to, but also to not go to the extreme of condoning inappropriate behavior. But I think sharing kind of that personal example, story of what that looked like for you at a younger age, often students, it kind of lowers the intensity of the conversation. They feel like you are meeting them where they're at, and I think that can be a valuable way to at least broach that topic initially. As far as how do you continue to have the conversation, I think having that ongoing rhythm of it's just normal for our family to talk about issues is critical. And so, when you're around the dinner table, and this might look different depending on the dynamics of your family, but to talk about what you see in media, to talk about what you see in different ways, and to be able to help your students connect with this is what this is portraying. What do you think God feels about that? How does he think about that? What does his word say about that? And maybe if you need to have more of a one-on-one conversation, to be able to just check in, ask questions. One just suggestion I would give, if you're maybe trying to really walk alongside your student and encourage them and hold them accountable in this issue with pornography, would be to ask specific questions. It's very easy, and maybe not even intentionally, but to be vague in how you respond and to try to justify certain behaviors. But if you ask a very specific and poignant question, not to be accusatory, but out of compassion for them, it's a little bit harder, I think, for somebody to, without explicitly being dishonest, to, again, skirt their way around that. So that would be one thing I would encourage. Now, as a parent, what if you're at a place where you have a genuine concern that your student is actively viewing pornography? Or maybe you sense this, but you're not too sure, okay? I think when we check in and we ask, again, that whole idea of let's not be accusatory, but let's make sure we help them see the point is not that I'm offended with what you're doing. I'm not offended that you would choose to look at this. Ultimately, I'm saddened because I know it's not what God would desire for you, and I know how it can negatively impact your life going forward. So I'm not mad, I'm not angry, I'm not personally offended. I just want to help. I want to encourage. I want to be a support. I want to be an aid as you address that. And so as you walk along with your student, and if you share a concern, that you're not accusing them and you're not trying to push them down, but instead, I want to show grace to you. I want to pick you up. I want to help in any capacity that I can. And the point is, we want to head in the direction of loving Jesus and obeying him and pursuing him. And this is not helping in that. And so to meet them where they're at, I think, is critical. Again, another aspect to that is how are you, and this is such a humbling way, but how are you modeling, again, how you combat sin, how you deal with issues in your life that God wouldn't want, and yet you're trying to work through that to be more and more obedient and faithful to the Lord. As you are doing that with intentionality, your student gets to see that, and that will help and impact them and how they deal with pornography if that's a struggle that they have. So again, encourage you when you have those conversations, again, have a regular pattern, have a regular rhythm where they're used to you talking about it. Broach the subject, be intentional about it, have that be an ongoing conversation. This is not just a one-time thing, but it's going to be a necessary conversation piece for years. And again, we want to come alongside them for that. Two really great resources as far as some do's in the conversation and some don'ts. One, and these are on our resource list on Facebook, is through a website called internetmatters.org. They've got, again, several do's and don'ts that some of them are similar to what I've communicated. Others expand on that. Really encourage you to check that list out. Again, Family Life Today, I think, also has another great list of do's and don'ts. And again, just some basic things, but things I think that will be really helpful as you go from there's a need to have this conversation, but how do I actually do it? So encourage you to check out those resources. before we end, I just want to talk briefly about what does that look like for your family to develop really a strategy and how you're going to address this issue of pornography. And so I want to think just, from a sports analogy, how do you be defensive and how do you be offensive against this? Okay. So when you think about being defensive against this, being on guard against how prominent pornography is and how it could impact your family, I think the first thing is you need to be mindful of really weaknesses and the opportunities for temptation and kind of the avenues in which those could come. So maybe some basic questions, what are the devices in your home that have access to the internet? What devices are available to your students outside of the home that would also allow them access to the internet? If your student has a smartphone, what are the apps that they have on their phone? Kind of a tangent here, but apps like TikTok and Snapchat, and there's several other very prominent social media apps in and of themselves are not bad, but they have historically been known to be huge opportunities for pornography. And especially Snapchat, the fact that you can take an image, send it to somebody else, and the point of the app is that it will disappear within 10 seconds. You can just imagine how much that has been abused, and whether your student is actually wanting to abuse that or they're just a recipient of something, it can be a huge gateway to pornography. So do you know what apps your students have on their phones? Thinking about what streaming services do you have in your family? Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, Disney, all the other ones. Again, is there any limits that you have set to what your student is able to watch on that? Even YouTube, has some aspects of that could also be a gateway to some things. So I encourage you, make an assessment as a family. What are those opportunities for my student to potentially view pornography? And what are you going to do to try to address that? Okay, now, one thing with that would be you could use filters. And there's really two different types of filters. One is a filter that is meant to prevent access to certain things. You see this in the school district a lot, that computers there that students just can't access certain websites. Sometimes that can be frustrating because they can maybe overstep the intention of what they're meant for. But I highly recommend, especially if you have a younger student, the chances of them accidentally viewing pornography are huge. Again, some of the statistics we mentioned last time, the early age of pornography exposure is increasing more and more and more. Not all of that is intentional. Often it's something that they stumble upon. And so if you can have a filter in place that will prevent that from happening, I think that would be of great benefit. The other type of filter, and I recommend this especially as your student gets older and there's trust that's established and your relationship with them really evolves to be, I'm a brother in Christ with you, I'm a sister in Christ with you. And so collectively we both want to follow Jesus. I still have authority, but again, we are trying to hold each other accountable. There's several apps or filters where, again, instead of preventing things from being accessed, it simply reports everything that is accessed. And so there's a greater level of trust and there's a greater level of responsibility on the student's part. And yet there's a knowledge that whatever I'm going to be looking at on my phone, for example, I know my parents are going to see that. And so then there's a motivation, I think, as well to be careful in what they view and what they expose themselves to. Some of those filters cost money. And for a long time, I've personally just kind of been resistant to that. And yet I thought to myself, if I'm willing to spend money to view media, and often a lot of media is negative, why wouldn't I also be willing to spend money to make sure that what I'm viewing is going to be helpful and appropriate, and how much more for my family as well? So I encourage you maybe to assess that if that's at all something that you've pushed back just like I have as well. Last thing, how do you, thinking about a strategy for how you address pornography as a family, let's think offensively. This is maybe kind of unique, but I think if you can create in your family a normal aspect where you are a family that confesses sin to one another. This is awkward. This is not something that is typical. And yet when you own up to sin and you recognize it for what it is, you don't keep it in darkness, but you expose it and bring it to light, it changes things. Pornography, just like the sin of Adam and Eve, when we look at things that we're not supposed to, our main response often is we want to hide and we want to isolate and we don't want anybody to know about it. And I guarantee you, if your student has looked at pornography, they are probably feeling that in some capacity. And yet, if your family has trust that's established and you are modeling that as parents as well, that we confess our sin. We own up to it. We don't let it remain hidden, but we acknowledge it for what it is. I encourage you, look at Psalm 32 and Psalm 51 as David realized, man, his bones were weary because he kept his sin hidden, but when he confessed, and that changed everything for him. I think having a family goal where you are going to choose as a family, we want to live for Jesus. This is our main desire as a family. And when you have hard conversations like this, when maybe you even restrict access to certain things, rather than feeling weird about that, rather than being bitter or resentful, it changes the tone of that to where these are done because we want to follow Jesus. And I love Joshua 24:15, where he says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. How great would that be if each family could have that same battle cry as Joshua? Lastly, just encourage you to think about, with media input, what are you bringing in? I think of Philippians chapter 4, where, again, Paul is just encouraging them to think about the things that are going to be good and true and beneficial. And again, to have a priority, to have an offensive strategy that we are going to input into our minds the things that are going to help us so that we can live life for Jesus. And really, if we're focusing this way, pornography is not really even an issue because that's not where our attention, our draw is at this point. That's a lot to throw at you, but I encourage you to think about what that looks like for you and your family. And again, if you have any questions whatsoever, if you're in maybe a specific situation in this way and you just want some help in that or want to talk on the phone about that, I would love to do so. Have a great weekend, guys. We'll talk to you later. Thanks.